Hello, I am Sean Sands from Gamers with Jobs, and we are back for the last installment of my three-part series on action role-playing games. Somebody pointed out to me in one of the last videos, or maybe a comment somewhere, and I think it's a good one, is that to sort of picture this as, sort of a all-encompassing view of ARPGs probably is a little bold and a little bolder than I need to be, because really what I've been talking about is sort of these not 3D, third-person isometric point of view games specifically on the PC, and the ARPG genre is a lot bigger than that. But I did want to kind of dial it in and have some sort of focus. So we've looked at Path of Exile, and we've looked at Grim Dawn, and in both of those, I had to preface my comments by talking about the fact that I have not gotten as much time in the endgame states of those, and so haven't been able to kind of look at it from that perspective. That's not going to be true with Diablo 3. Diablo 3 is my home in a lot of ways for these types of games, but also has reached a point where one of the reasons I wanted to look elsewhere is because, Diablo 3, I think Diablo 3 has this impression of not having really lived up to its true potential. And while I've gotten genuinely more than 1,000 hours of enjoyment out of it, so I'm far from in a position to say, oh, it underwhelmed or it didn't live up to expectations. At the same time, I do see a lot of what people are talking about when they make those kinds of statements. Because if you look at a game like Path of Exile, and while we're talking, we'll go ahead and just sort of start a game here. We'll create a new hero, and then I'll finish my thought. We will create a wizard, and we'll just name this wizard Beth. I don't know. We'll do it like this. Who knows? Doesn't matter. We will create Beth, the wizardress, and we will start as almost anyone would. So I want to stay true to what I've been doing so far, which is taking a look at this in the perspective of how a new player would come to it. So even as I jump in, I'm not starting a season here. I'm not doing anything, kind of the stuff I would normally do, like jumping right into bounties or greater rifts or all that stuff. And we'll cover that in a minute. And we're not going to use my extensive Paragon points that I've got. This is what it would look like if you just jumped in. So I want to go back to my point, which is that, I think particularly Path of Exile, but to an extent Grim Dawn as well, have the luxury in one side of not kind of being burdened by the same expectations that Diablo 3 had. But also, they also weren't burdened by a legacy that, maybe they weren't prepared to fill. And certainly, Diablo 3 as a game has improved over the months and years that it's been out. Having started on that first day and experienced the random disconnects and the real money auction house and the required connectivity and all the things that sort of burdened the Diablo 3 launch, we're a long, long way from that now, and sort of a typical Blizzard style, right? World of Warcraft is very different than it was when it started. And of course, Path of Exile is too. But I think when I look at the genre as a whole, God, it's been so long since I've actually done the actual main campaign here. But when I look at the genre as a whole, I really see Diablo 3 as something that got people interested in ARPGs again. But I don't think it really fulfilled the kind of creative expectations that people have. And then when I look at something like Path of Exile, and even Grim Dawn, and who knows what the future holds. I think I see a lot of things to get excited. Get out of my way, dude. A lot of things to get excited about. And a lot more just sort of diversity and approaches to the gameplay. Mixing it up. I think of specifically with Path of Exile. I think of its approach to skills development and its approach to loot and why you have equipment, and even Grim Dawn in the way that it it focuses on kind of mixing and matching and having builds that are not simply, kind of segments of a skill, but are, sort of more based around, in part, base damage multiplied by a factor. Which is not to say, again, that that's not something Diablo 3 has, but I think it's core to a concept in a way that it isn't with Diablo 3. Diablo 3 is ultimately very specific in kind of what it does really well. It is a fervent action game. It is really leaning on that side of things, and even though it starts kind of slow here, as we'll see in a minute, when you're really digging in, when you've got this thing running at at capacity, things happen quickly. There's lots of corpses exploding and lots of action on the screen. It's sort of about the special effects. It's sort of the with apologies, the Michael Bay of the ARPG genre. It is bombastic and kind of at times almost a parody of itself, which again, I sound so critical of it in that way, but at the same time, I also really like that, right? We all sort of have our guilty pleasures, and to some degree, Diablo 3 has been a guilty pleasure for me. What I don't think it has is a lot of the it has gotten so interested and focused on creating a player experience that is almost clinical at this point. I get these blue items and they're already sort of discovered for me. I don't have to really spend any time or effort looking at it. The equipment is really fairly straightforward. Things, if things to the point where it'll even show you this will increase you. And again, I'm not saying this is exclusive to Diablo 3, but it feels very core to the way it handles itself, and has reduced sort of down the complexity to the point where it's just greater number is better than smaller number in all cases. It doesn't feel like there is many interesting decisions to be made. The skill tree is, sort of Diablo's own. It lives in its own world. You can't see it now because I had completely forgotten about this. You can't unlock skills runes until level 6, but you'll begin to develop skills, and then you'll pick sort of a modifier for each of the skills that you want to have. And that's sort of how you make your build. I think where it's problematic for me is it doesn't feel like it has as many interesting choices. And I think, particularly Blizzard, and I realize, with any of these games, there are some optimal builds, right? Even with Path of Exile and its absolutely huge skill tree, there's just some things you specifically do. But if nothing else, it gives the illusion and at least the opportunity to be extraordinarily creative in a way that I don't feel like Diablo 3 does as much. I remember, kind of missing a breadth of skills that went beyond simply here's your latest laser beam, here's your latest trap, here's your latest whatever. I just frankly like Diablo 2's skill tree approach better, having to make hard choices that seem very much based on a different styles, different approaches. Those things still exist in Diablo 3, but I don't think they're as clear. I don't think they're as obvious, and I think there are some, I think as with. And I say this is kind of a problem with almost all Blizzard games. There are definitely some optimal choices that you simply cannot ignore if you're going to build, particularly when we get into season play, and we'll move on here from sort of the basics in just a moment. But with the amount of competitive component that Diablo 3 has built over the year, particularly within its season play, particularly sort of running greater rifts, which is a little bit like the map system, I think, and a little bit to a lesser extent like the Crucible system we looked at in Grim Dawn. To get really into a place where you're effective, you have to sort of adopt some standards. And again, because to me at least, it feels like the number of interesting choices available to you is relatively small. Then it feels even more locked down. I realize it sounds like I'm kind of poo-pooing Diablo 3 here, and I don't want to set that impression because there's a reason I've played it for thousands of hours, and it's because there is something incredibly addictive about it too. It has a wonderful pace. I love this component here where you start stringing together kills, or you start stringing together, breaking down stuff. And you get these little bonuses out of it that came really from the console side of things. The feel, like there's just nobody gets the feel of this down quite like Blizzard does. Everything feels tight and smooth, and the way it feels like it should feel. I rarely find myself, feeling like I clicked something and I didn't get the result and the action that I wanted out of it. Diablo 3, for whatever you can say about it, is an incredibly polished game from the pure gameplay perspective. Now, it's not to say it doesn't have problems, not to say it doesn't have areas where it can be optimized and improved. And one of the things I do like is that Blizzard has been quite willing to make those kinds of changes over the months and years it's been out. Like we said at the start, this is not remotely the same game we began with, back 3 years ago. Some of that for the most of that, a lot of that for the better, but not all of it. Right? It's also, I think, a simpler game where it took something that wasn't overly complex to begin with. Right? There's some sort of nostalgic component of me that does miss. Having to fight on the hardest, or not even necessarily the hardest difficulty, but a hard difficulty, having to fight a rare group of monsters and spend a couple of minutes on them and maybe die, like have that sense that they were dangerous, back in the day where, you would get a legendary every 3 or 4 hours if you were lucky, or even worse in some cases. The game's not like that at all now, to the point where even in the season mode, when you get your first character to 70, which honestly, for somebody who's pretty comfortable with it now, does not take all that long. The game just starts handing out legendaries and set items and not crafted items, but legendary items and things that set items. Just start handing them out like candy. Like they literally put it in your email. Right down at the bottom, you get this little thing called Hadrig's Gift when once you've completed a couple of the achievements and gotten a level 70 characters. Like, oh, here's your legendary build that you can start working on, which is great in the one hand, right? It makes you feel very, very powerful very, very quickly, but it also lacks some of that sense of discovery and adventure. I want to really acknowledge, though, that this is not just like part of the problem here is me, because I have this not deep, but I have this extensive amount of playtime. Again, far from top tier, right? I'm like middle of the pack at best, but 1,000+ hours of game time is certainly enough to have felt like you've seen a lot of what the game has to offer. And I don't have that. I still have this opportunity of a lot more discovery associated with Grim Dawn and Path of Exile. So I guess, you kind of have to temper it with that. So it's kind of a brief overview of what the game just basically looks like if you're, happen to be a person who has not played it. This is just, the single player campaign is this. But unlike, I would say, Path of Exile and Grim Dawn, you may play the single player campaign. I mean, you may play it a ton of times, but the game no longer sort of encourages you to come plugging back in here over and over again, to the point where even though, in the past 200, 300, 400 hours of playing the game, even when I'm leveling up a new character in the season, this is the first time I've actually been back in the campaign mode, which is interesting, which is a different approach. And kind of gets to the heart of some of the differences. So we've taken a look at what the lower level start is. I'll dive into one of my later characters. I'll give you a kind of quick glimpse into my current season character, which honestly I played a little bit of this season, but not an absolute ton. Well, I mean, I've played this character 27 hours, so take that for what it is. For some people, that will be a ridiculous amount of time to have put in only one season. For others, you will realize that's barely scratching the surface. But in those 27 hours, again, the amount of time that I've played. Less than the amount of time I played Grim Dawn, far less than the amount of time I played Path of Exile. I have a maxed out character, with kind of a really strong build to work from. And in fact, even though I'm here in Torment 8, which is, I like, the difficulty levels are ridiculous now. I think it goes up to something like Torment 12, where it's, you take it something like Path of Exile, which has normal and cruel and merciless or something like that, and you're just, this thing has like 12 versions of that, and even taking that into account, I'll pull up my little army here. I go into, a map like this one, and I just kind of evaporate stuff as I go through. This is probably well below the kind of content I would normally be playing. Stuff just kind of goes away. I'm barely thinking about it, which is part of the fun, again, of these kinds of games. Being able to just dive in and not really have to think about it. There's something I've been thinking about recently, which is this idea of the physicality of these kind of games. I love the feel of the clip. And Diablo does it. I mean, nobody really beats Diablo on that front, in the sense that, at least in my mind, the smoothness of the game, the way it feels, is fundamentally really, really appealing to me. You can't, it would be nice to make some sort of bold judgment call here and say, it's the best at it. There is no saying that sort of thing. It's good. It's certainly. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to be. Yeah, this is like this. Poof. There's some sort of ridiculous, like that. That showing up of a set item back in 2 years ago would have been such an amazing moment. It would have been like, oh my God, this may, that could be anything. And I don't have that feeling. I do kind of miss that feeling. Right now, it's just sort of plugging away at it. What I'm doing here, again, if you're using the Diablo regular, is I'm doing what's called a Nephilim riff, which is really how you play the game now for the most part. There's sort of, well, that's not true. Oh, there's another legendary. I mean, there you go. It's Diablo in a nutshell now. There's really three things you do now rather than go in and actually do the campaign mode. And I think this probably correlates to this sort of, the map stuff that you do at the end of, endgame of Path of Exile. And you can either run these riffs just for, general loot. You can go into campaign mode maps, but they're what's called bounties, where you'll do these sort of mini missions associated with it. And you can go in there to get, a variety of stuff, certain crafting things to craft stuff with. And, God, what do you actually get? You get some, oh yeah, to cube stuff with. Don't worry about what all that means. Just, you get stuff so that you can kind of enhance or upgrade your gear. This is just to kind of find gear. Oh, there's another legendary. Are they that legendary at this point? They can't be. But what I think most people do is they run the greater rifts, which are a different kind of rift. A rift is just sort of a collection of attached random map types, designed to kind of take a few minutes. Once this bar fills up, I will fight the rift boss, which will be one of, 6 or 7 different boss types. And that this bar progresses as I kill creatures, and then once it's done, I'll close the rift, and I can just do it again from there. Greater rifts are like that too, except that they don't drop any loot during the rift. You just are kind of running through, and you pick up orbs occasionally to progress the bar. But they are the competitive mode I think primarily. I mean, you can also sort of upgrade some gems at the end of it and do some other stuff. It's not, a waste of time unless if you're not competitive. That's not the point. But I think the people who are really into it, they're in here because they're trying to get up on the leaderboard. Whoa! I hear a bunch of. Do I hear a bunch? No, I just hear one. Yeah. No, it's not a legendary per se. It's just a crafting recipe for a legendary. But yeah, that's really where the leaderboard and the competitive stuff is. Just wait until I'm done being trapped there. So I don't know. I really like this in the sense of just sort of a mindless quick fest. I do like this. Like the game makes you feel very powerful. It doesn't, your character. And this was one of the places I think I struggled early on with something more like Path of Exile and Grim Dawn, is that I didn't feel real powerful real quick. But even when I was playing that level 1 character a few minutes ago, just kind of running around in a normal environment, I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to think about anything. I could just sort of click on things, and unless I made some really dumb mistakes, they were probably going to die. And then here at the endgame mode, it's the same basic idea. Which again, I wonder how much of that is, the fact that I've had so much time with Diablo 3 versus the other games, or if that is something specific to Diablo 3. Because I think there is a natural implication. And this has been interesting to watch because I see it in people of every game. The more you play the game, the more you kind of uncover its flaws, the more you can kind of manipulate it and lose the magic of it. I think, if you've played Path of Exile for 2,000 hours, there's only so much sort of new stuff you can learn about the game. And I think that's the disappointing thing. Nothing sort of stays gold and new forever. And that's why I'm glad. And that's really, I think, why I wanted to talk about the genre in the big. Because historically, for a lot of these sort of top-down isometric ARPGs, there's really only been one game in town. And it's nice to have a fleshed-out, stronger genre where that's not true, where there are multiple games in town, and while they carry a common theme and a commonality among them, in just the kind of base mechanics of running around and clicking on stuff till they drop something cool, and whether that's a piece of legendary gear, whether that is orbs, whether that is money, or different types of currency, whatever. Like that core idea is one that for me has always been compelling. It always keeps me coming back. Right? There's something about that click on the ground, that bump it into an enemy, putting your mouse on them and just sort of watching them evaporate. There's something about levels and assigning new points and learning new skills. There's something about finding a build that just feels right to you and executing it well, that is super addicting. And it doesn't really matter in the end whether you're playing Diablo 3 or Grim Dawn or Path of Exile, or even if you play one for a very, very long time. That's the thing that feels new to me and exciting, is I can get to the end of 1,000 hours of Diablo 3 and go and discover something like Path of Exile or Grim Dawn and be excited again. And hopefully that sustains. Hopefully around the corner there will be more of those kinds of games. Or a new expansion that unlocks some, new mechanic or something like that. Having that sort of wheel turning where there's something new around the bend, where if you get bored, if you get burnt out, you kind of have to own that as something you've done too. Because if you start up your game, your Path of Exile, your Diablo 3, whatever, and you're just like, I'm just not feeling it anymore, there's something else. And that's cool. That's nice. I don't feel like we've always had that in ARPGs. Diablo 3, how do you kind of wrap up Diablo 3? There's so much history to it. There's so much sort of controversy around it. There's so much change that's happened to it. In the end, I have to kind of have a soft spot in my heart for it. Not just for the amount of time that I've put into it, but just also the road I've traveled with it and the long journey I've enjoyed with it at this point. Some of it good, some of it bad, but it's like a complicated relationship in a way. As you know, it's starting to wind down. You can look back on it, and even the tougher times, they have a nostalgia to them. That's how I think about Diablo 3. It feels like a home that I'm planning to move out of. And that's okay. It's done a lot for me. It's a cool game, and if you've never played it, you should. Like you really should at this point. If you've never played Path of Exile, you should. If you've never played Grim Dawn and you want something new, you should. And that was really all I was trying to get at with these three videos. Is it's nice to have these three really great games, very similar in some ways, very different in others, but that have their own charm and their own identity to them. So that's the state of ARPGs. It's actually pretty good. What I'm hoping is it improves, that we see more developers kind of getting into these top-down 3D isometric views games, these action role-playing games, these click fests, and bringing their own new ideas to how you create a progression tree and how you create diversity in builds and how you create a cool new loot system and how have somebody still have played 500, 600 hours and find something new and interesting for the first time. It's a really huge challenge in one sense, but it's a really cool one at the same time. So, I don't know. I hope you've enjoyed this series. I hope you've found something interesting and worth playing again, or for the first time. But anyway, until next time, as always, my name is Sean Sands from Gamers with Jobs. Thank you for joining me for this state of ARPGs. Maybe I'll come back and look over it again after I've had some chance to kind of dive into the end game of some of the other titles we looked at. Maybe if anybody has a recommendation for a game I should have looked at, I'd love you to drop a comment on that. But thank you for joining me. We will see you again soon.